There's been a lot of discussion throughout the days, and by the way, Kathy, thank you for plugging this as much as you did. There's been a lot of discussion during the day about education and the importance of education, and this cyber piece certainly is a large part of why education is as important as it is. For those of you that do not have a game plan, you're in a lot of trouble, but let me start this with, if I asked all of you what's the most important asset you have in your companies, what would it be? Mary Jo?
Your information, your data.
Oh, you all hear what she said? Your information, your data. Not only do you have information that's critical to your company in terms of your employee information, but you also have data and information that's critical to your customers, whether they're residential or they're commercial. And that's really the value of your company in this day and age. So if you get hacked, and by the way, if you talk to the professionals, there are really only two kinds of companies, those that have been hacked and know it, and those that have been hacked and don't know it. So you can kind of figure out where you are in the process. For those of you who have a sort of look or view of things that says, well, you know, we're a small company, we're pretty much down the radar, nobody's going to care about what happens to us, the largest hacks typically come because there's a third party involved. So if you're providing services in a building and you have access to the tenants' computers because you're helping them with the security, because you're detecting rather than protecting, you're vulnerable. Most of the large companies in particular have lots of controls and lots of redundancies in their systems, but it's the security company they get through, it's the air conditioning units they get through. So there's all kinds of ways that you're at risk that aren't quite so obvious. So this is sort of a laundry list of the things that can happen, and I'm going to try to get us all back on track. So I'm going to try to cut this down, get you all out by 5, and still leave some time for some questions. But the system shuts down. Everything stops. You lose goodwill. I mean, you guys can all read this list. It becomes a nightmare. Bloomberg Law has done a survey. Most companies, particularly smaller ones, are really worried about their brand, their reputation, and that's really what we're talking about here. You folks are all in the security industry. If you get hacked and your customer's data gets out there, what does that do to your reputation? Is anybody really going to want to buy a system from you? Probably not. So let me sort of jump through this. There are really three types of, or three hacker motives, and they're all kind of intertwined. One is criminal intent, one is corporate espionage, and one is state actors. Now, if you all are sitting here and saying, well, I doubt very much I've got anything to do with state actors, let me suggest to you what happened with the Office of Personnel Management and then sort of bring it back down. OPM is the organization within the federal government that keeps information about all of the government employees. And you know, about 6 months ago, it was publicly announced they were hacked. We're beginning to hear stories about the reason for the hack, which has been, at least on paper, assigned to the Chinese, is because they're looking for spies. Now, they're trying to identify spies so that they can figure out how to corrupt them, how to turn them. So if you provide security systems in an actor's home, for example, or some other prominent individual and somebody's trying to get to them, there's the potential for a problem. If you provide systems in a secure environment, if you provide systems in a corporate environment, and the corporation has a high-profile executive, there's all kinds of things that can happen. And for those of you that want to sort of look at this and kind of think about it and say, well, not really me, here's the trick that's going on that's driving everybody crazy. They get into your system, they figure out who the key people are in your organization, and typically the way it goes is the CFO sends an email, the CEO sends an email to the CFO saying, send a check for so much to so-and-so for this reason. Could be a small amount, could be a large amount. It's not a real transaction, and all of a sudden you've got money going out the door. We've seen them test it on expense reports where the amount in question is as low as $200. They're just testing the system to see how much can they get away with. So your own systems are at risk as well as your customers. For anybody that's still in doubt, here's the list. It's pretty much everything. If you get hacked, everything that you take for granted is at risk. All of your customer, all of your employee data, all of your contracts, everything that you need to do business. And pardon me while I uncork this for just a second. Now, I want to try to make this a little bit of an interactive session, and I can't do as well as Dave because he's just really good. But let me kind of walk you through some things, and I'm going to skip some of this just for the interest of getting through it quickly. If this doesn't scare the pants off of you, you're not paying attention. This is a report that the US Senate issued earlier this year. There are hacks that have been so successful that they have gotten into the wheelhouse of a commercial vessel at sea or a plane. All the result of hacks. So if they can get in there, you can imagine what they're going to want to do to just get into systems. Let's talk about the framework. Right now, there is no federal standard for cybersecurity. We are as far as there is a version of the bill that the Senate has approved and there is a version of the bill that the House has approved. They have not yet done conference committee. So we don't know what it's going to look like. We can all guess, but let's not. What you're facing right now is that there are 45 plus states, each of which has their own view, so that if you have personal information that is hacked and put out there, so personal information, the individual's name, their social security number, that's usually enough. You often have also other information like credit card payments. You have username and password. So you have combinations of data that together are viewed as personally identifiable information. That has value. It's being commoditized. Depending on how large the list is, it could be $500, it could be $5,000, but they're getting paid for this data. So once it's out there, according to the laws of almost every state, you have to give notice to everybody that's impacted. In California, we have a unique statute that allows us not to do that if we're asked by federal law enforcement, by law enforcement or prosecutors not to share the information. And the reason they will do that is they believe it will compromise the investigation. Otherwise, you're stuck giving all kinds of information, all kinds of notice. And for any of us that have been on the receiving end, in my case, it was the UCLA hack, you get all of this information about you've been hacked, this is what you can do. So one of the questions is, what is your process? And what I'm going to talk about really is all about process. Because the experts will tell you, you will get hacked. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the issue for all of us in this day and age is, once that happens, what are we doing? How are we preparing for it, and how are we responding to it? So that's really where I want to focus today for just a little bit. So first of all, is it getting C-suite attention? Then I want to talk a little bit about pre-breach and post-breach. And then I'm going to give you an illustration, and this is where I'm going to do my imitation of Dave. I'm going to give you a hypothetical, and I want to talk a little bit about, what would you want to do? How would you want to deal with it? So first of all, from the C-suite perspective, and I'm sure you all know what they're referring to as the CEO, CFO, CIO, that level. So it's no longer, if you have an IT system in your company, and everybody does, it's no longer a question of what's the IT director doing. This has to be really dealt with at the top of the company. It has to be a priority, or it won't work right. The biggest headaches for all of us are these devices. You can have all the great security in the world, but when somebody doesn't follow it, you will get in trouble. I can tell you, one of our clients, somebody in the company received one of these infamous phishing emails. Those are the ones that look like they're legit and they really aren't, and they clicked on it. And a couple weeks later, they got a little love note that said, if you don't pay us X amount, and we'll talk about what X amount is in a minute, in the next 48 hours, we're going to shut down your system. And the person ignored it. And of course, the system got shut down. Now, for most of us, we've got so much data that it's now physically impossible to restore it all. And even if you wanted to, these guys have gotten smart. When the hackers started, what they would do is they would put the virus in your system, they would shut you down, and you would use your backup tapes to restore everything. Now, they put the virus in, they leave the decryption key in, they invade your backup, whatever form it takes, and then they shut you down. Have you ever tried to restore terabytes of data that go on forever? It's a hugely complicated process. This particular client was asked to pay $1,500 in Bitcoins. Now, you all understand about Bitcoins, they're not traceable. The conversations with law enforcement went like this. Yeah, we know who did this. The guy's sitting on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean. And, you know, your choice is you pay him and you get the decryption key, or, you know, we can go after him, but we'll never get him. So they're getting a little more bold, but it's in the $1,500 to $2,000 range, and you get the key and off you go. I've heard some numbers as high as $12,000. Even if it's 20 or 30 or 50, it's cheaper than trying to restore your system. So what are you doing with your IT systems? And I guess we shouldn't really call them IT anymore. I guess we really should call them, what are you doing with your technology? Here's the key, for those of you not already familiar with it. If the device can be connected to the internet, it is susceptible to being hacked, which is why the smartphones are such a problem. This is all about your bottom line. You're trying to prevent costly delays, you're trying to prevent customer service problems, and as much as I enjoy all of your company, I'm sure you don't really want to have to come to us when things go wrong. It's very expensive. So, pre-breach. Have you all figured out what you want to do if there is a breach? Have you gone through and surveyed what you have? Who has what information? Where is it stored? Who's the list? When things go wrong, who's on the list that's going to be called? So somebody's going to figure out that there's been a hack. Who's on the team? Sometimes referred to as the red team. Who's the lawyer? Who's the PR consultant? Who's the IT consultant? Is it somebody internally, externally? Who are you going to put together on that crisis team? Have you figured that out ahead of time? Do they all know each other? Does everybody know what their role is? Have you circulated the information? If you haven't done the basics, it's going to be a mess. That's just the only way to describe it. We all pride ourselves in being able to function in crisis. This one will really test you if you haven't gotten ready for it. So once you've put the team together, once you've figured out who's going to do what, have you done any training? Now, I know that that's a terrible word. We all prefer education. But this really is all about, has everybody gotten together and practiced? Do we know what we're going to do if the time comes? You know, it's kind of like when you get together with your family and you say, well, if you're here and I'm there and there's an earthquake and we can't get together, here's the place we're meeting. So have you done something comparable with your company? Is there, in essence, an emergency preparedness plan? This is the only standard that we're dealing with right now. This is federal standard. This is what the National Institutes for Science and Technology, and you can see that it's a circle. It keeps going around, and it keeps going around intentionally. The idea is to identify what's going on, to protect your assets, to detect the problems, to respond to them, to recover, and to keep going around and around, because this is an ongoing process. So also keep in mind, and I'll return to this, that there's increased liability for individuals as well as companies. So the question for all of you is, where are you at in the review process? And it is an ongoing review process. Do you have a board resolution that says something as simple as, you know, we comply with a law, which we probably all have in some form or another, but what about one that talks about, or other material that talk about what your values are and what you're promising your customers? Because that's going to be the legal standard when something goes wrong. Do you have the preparedness plan? Have you figured out what the incident crisis plan is? Are you using analytics? Are you checking what's going on with your system? Do you have terms and conditions? Are your privacy controls in order? Let me keep going here. So, as I said earlier, the real key is not necessarily only your system, but also those of third parties. So, how many of you are offering video? Most of the hands are going up. Okay. Let's start with, have you revised, and I assume the answer is going to be yes, but I could be off base here. Have you revised your approach to contemplate the additional risks that video include? For example, Who holds the data? Is it on your server? Is it on the user's server? If it's on the user's server, which is, as I understand it, the more popular option, do you have a provision in your agreements, and are you otherwise dealing with them to make clear there's a privacy concern there? We were talking, Mary Jo and I were talking about this earlier. You know, if I'm in my house and you come visit me, you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, to use the term in the law. But what about if I'm videoing everything? You guys don't want to be liable for that invasion of privacy. Another issue that comes up, particularly now with cloud computing, is, you know, where's the information? Where is the server located? We all do business in the US, but is that where the cloud computing provider is holding all of the data? Because if the data is even bouncing through the EU, you're subject to their rules. I was on a panel discussion a couple of months ago with a colleague of mine from Canada, and we were talking about national security and privacy rights and the intersection of the two. And she was telling the story that they have what they call a hopscotch situation, which is it's a call between two Canadian companies, but because of the way the phone lines work, it comes through the US. So they have a lot of concerns about it's gotten to the US, how is that data being used? If our data is going just because of the way that the circuitry is set up from here to Canada or here to Mexico, you know, what are your concerns there? And keep in mind also, which I know sounds like it's totally ridiculous, that there are Department of State, Department of Commerce, and Office of Foreign Assets Control rules about who you can do business with and where they're located. And by the way, some of those are domestically within the US. So there are other considerations as well. I've shown you that already. So have you tested your company's compliance controls? And what I mean by that is, if you're saying this is the level of service that I'm providing, are you doing that? And how does that overlap with what you're doing from a cyber perspective? Are you in full compliance with all the laws and regulations? Have you figured out, for example, when you have to give notice, to whom you have to give notice, and are you ready to do that? Are you in full compliance with your company policy? And this again goes to, what are you promising to your consumers, and are you able to meet that? And then, of course, are you evaluating and properly vetting both your customers and your employees? And let me give you an illustration here. We're in California. We have marijuana clinics. And I know from talking to some folks in that industry, you know, there's a higher risk when you have a security system in a marijuana shop than if you have it in, you know, Susie's pie store. And you clearly want to know that for risk purposes, and you clearly want to know that to figure out whether it's a customer you want to take on. And I can tell you I've seen some cases where the argument has been, were there enough cameras put in? Now, I know this comes up in all kinds of contexts, but when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars of marijuana, if not more, it becomes a bigger discussion. And so, you know, we're all for let's sign the customers up and let's get them going, but have we got some provisions in place that actually cause us to say, well, this is a potential red flag, and let's back up and see if this is somebody we want to deal with. So one of the keys is testing your employees' knowledge. What do they understand? You know, it's great that you train the sales force and they go out and they do, but have you checked it recently to make sure that they're actually doing what they say they're doing and that they actually understand what they should be doing and that they're not compromising the cyber end of things? You know, we're talking about hacks and we're talking about them being external, but you know, a lot of times they're internal. We've had lots of cases where somebody gets fired and stupidly the IT director doesn't cut off their access to the system before they're fired or contemporaneous with them being fired. They're naturally upset. They want to exact their pound of flesh, so they just simply take data and up it goes up on the web. Trust me, you don't want to be in that position. The other one, as I said, is, of course, to know your customers. So here's the hypothetical. I'm now going to do my Dave imitation. And I set this up intentionally as a residential example, but it obviously could just as easily be a commercial example. So ABC Alarm Company has an app, nooffensealarm.com. I think you're great. We've got that app. The app is downloaded, because we all know how easy it is. You figure out what the app is, you just download it. So the app is downloaded. And then the thieves get into the system and steal username and passwords. And those same thieves then take that information and use it to break into homes and steal valuables. And we're going to assume, for purposes of this illustration, that they know how to pick locks, so there's no visible damage. So they turn off the system, they get in, they take whatever they're going to take, they leave, they turn the system back on. And it turns out that the way that they got in and the way that the system got compromised was, in fact, because there was a phishing email where somebody clicked on it and the system then got infected. And law enforcement starts to track, as they do with these kinds of things, what has gone on. And the one uniform thing in all of this is that ABC is the security company, it's the alarm company. So they come to you, you're the CEO of the company. It's usually a couple of guys, depending on which organization it is. Maybe they're in suits, maybe they're in uniform, usually with guns, sometimes visible, sometimes not so visible, and then they give you the bad news. Your system has been compromised. The data is available, it is being used by the bad guys. Now what? Anybody want to take a shot at this? I'm going to put Kathy on the spot just because you're the president. And it was an inside job. So they're going to start with, they want to talk to every one of your employees. They're going to want to know what your hiring procedures are. They're going to want to know why you haven't figured out that somebody's living way high off the hog in direct contradiction to what their income may be. So it becomes a mess. What else are you going to do? Call me, that's good. Okay. What else?
Full compliance.
Sorry?
Full compliance.
Full compliance. What else? How about call your insurance company? Okay? One of the first things you're going to want to do is pull out that list that you've worked up of what your crisis team is going to do and call every one of the professionals on that list, starting with the lawyer, the IT consultant, and we usually bring in forensic folks to deal with this, and then also your PR folks. You now have a crisis on your hands, and one of the decisions you need to make as a business owner is, am I going to be the public face of this, or are we going to hire somebody to do that who's far more adept at dealing with the press? Now, I'm not here to suggest to you that every company that suffers this kind of problem needs a $5 million team, but I am suggesting to you that there are going to be those occasions where maybe you don't want to handle it. Maybe it really does make more sense for you to have a PR consultant. And a lot of it's going to depend on, are you the flavor of the 5 minutes in the 24-hour news cycle, or is this a more sustained situation? So for example, just to keep going with my illustration, if the break-ins were all in a small cluster of blocks, that may be one thing. But if the break-ins are all in a larger county area where you may be attracting more attention, you may want to look at that differently. And there are pluses and minuses to both, but certainly calling the insurance folks is critical. So let me walk you through quickly sort of the post-breach, what happens. The first thing is secure your system. Now, I've got another slide. That does not mean turn it off. But it does mean do what you can to save the data, to figure out how you got compromised. The popular perception is that the IT companies, and by this I mean, the Googles of the world or the Yahoos of the world, that they keep this information for a long time. They actually don't. They actually keep what's called the ephemeral data, the data that shows which connection went to where, for only about 2, 3, 4 days. So this is the kind of situation that if you have a serious hack or a serious intrusion, as law enforcement likes to call it, you really need to take action quickly. So secure your system, and then this was actually the list I was looking for, Kathy, so I took advantage of you. Call your attorney, call your insurer, get the PR team in, and then you make a decision if you've figured out that what the problem is, whether or not you bring in law enforcement. And obviously not every case is appropriate to bring in law enforcement, any more than every burglary where the only thing that happens is you end up with, a damaged doorknob may certainly not require as much attention as something more significant. And then you have to begin the question of who do I have to give notice to, and implementing the rest of your crisis team plan. So preserve evidence, what do you have where? If you've tested your process recently, then you know who's got which device. You know things as basic as, is all the data on one server? Does everybody who has one of these devices, do they have information on their device I don't have on the server? Do they have a laptop? Is it resident there? Is it on the server? So you're trying to gather all the information so you can figure out what happened. We prefer to use outside IT consultants only because they know how to do this in a manner that preserves the data. But whether you do it internally or externally, the key is knowing what to do and who says what to whom and when and how. And what do I mean here? So first of all, from the PR side, and this is why oftentimes if it's significant enough you want somebody external, is you want somebody to be able to tell the truth without making judicial admissions. Now I know that sounds funny coming from a lawyer, but it really is all about spinning the story in an altogether different context, which I realize doesn't apply here. But we had a case where our client was accused of selling food that ostensibly killed somebody. Now that's pretty serious stuff. And the PR folks worked with us, and what we were able eventually to do was to figure out that the food had nothing to do with what happened to this unfortunate incident, or individual rather. But the PR guys were able to work with us to track down where a lot of the stuff came from, and we had other means of finding out the information. And as you're going through all of this, you're learning. So you're reevaluating and reassessing your response plan, and you'll notice I added against insurance coverage. I know that there's several insurance brokers and agents here that are well-known in the industry and well-known to the association. Ask them what kind of coverage they have available. What we have found is that typically it does not, cyber coverage is not included. It is typically something you have to get separately. So if you don't have it, find out about it. Here's the other area that, I'm a lawyer, I get to bring you really bad news. I mean, that's the only way to describe it. We are seeing a tremendous number of class action lawsuits. Now, admittedly, most of them are of the target variety where thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people had their information compromised, but it's becoming more and more the action or the case, and particularly in California where it's relatively easy to get a class action lawsuit certified. The shareholder derivative lawsuits come up because you're a publicly traded company. I don't know how many there are in the room, but that does occur. And then there's always corporate and individual liability. And the reason that this becomes a question, and you've heard me say a couple of times, what's your corporate philosophy? What have you said you're going to do? If you're giving consumers certain assurances and they're not within what the company is doing, that's potentially problematic. If you're saying things that are not quite correct, that's potentially problematic. Law enforcement takes a really dim view of that. Giving them half an answer and then finding out you have to correct it later is also problematic. I want to spend a minute on this because this is the latest development in individual liability. I know it sounds odd to be discussing it in this context, but as we're beginning to see cyber become more and more of an issue and higher up on the list of priorities for companies, we're also beginning to see that the federal government take an interest in it. Their interest has always been there, but it's become more critical. And if you have a situation where you have customers in more than one state, you're now potentially subject to federal jurisdiction. Now, typically when there's a hack, it's the hackers that they go after, and it's the hackers they're looking to throw in jail. But even if you're not in a situation where they're looking at you criminally, there's still a lot of money tied up, and there's still the potential for a lot of damages. But if you are in a situation where, because you didn't even, for example, follow the NIST standard that I had put up earlier, the government's basically said, the DOJ has said, if we have a company come before us, so if your local U.S. attorney, if they open a case on your company, if you've come to the attention of the U.S. Attorney's Office, they're going to look at your cybersecurity. And if you're not at least meeting the standard that NIST has articulated, they're going to look at that. And when I say they're going to look at that, what I mean is they're going to look at the corporate officers individually. Now, I don't want to sound like the only option here is doom and gloom, but I do want to be honest and say this is becoming ever more popular an area for the government to look at carefully. And so what I want to do is just take a couple of minutes. This Yates memo has caused a lot of consternation because what it basically says, and I won't go through all the slides, just again as an expediency, is before the US government will settle with a company, the company needs, in essence, to rat out the individuals that are responsible. So at this point, if the company wants to get the benefit of lower fines, you have to be willing to turn over your employees, turn over your fellow managers, sometimes turn over your partners, just because that's the only way out. Not a great position to be in. I guess this is the one slide out of this that I want to show you. Attorneys are expected, and this is the Department of Justice U.S. attorneys, are expected to focus on individual wrongdoing while also evaluating corporate malfeasance. Now, for anybody that isn't getting the message, this is an outgrowth of the 2008, 2009 banking crisis. So many people complain to the Department of Justice why nobody went to jail that they've now finally done this. So be careful what you wish for. This whole process, now that I've hopefully scared the crap out of you, really is all about due diligence. Have you figured out a process? Do you have it documented? If something goes wrong, have you followed that process? Have you taken it to the logical conclusion? Once you've been through it and you've seen what happens, have you updated it? Are you keeping current? Because in the end, what this is really all about, when and if you get sued by any of your customers, is were you negligent? Did you meet the standard of care? Now, one of the nice things about standard of care from a lawyer point of view is it can mean almost anything. So if one of the projects the association wants to take on is maybe some standards, or maybe develop a set of protocols that any alarm company might want to use for in this context, that could be helpful. It's a huge project, but it's certainly something that would set a standard of care, and I know that there has been a discussion about those that are not members and doing wild and crazy things. This may be one way for you to set a standard. But in the end, it really is all about having paid attention to what's going on within your company and figuring out what the process is that works for you so that you're able to not only protect the most valuable assets you have, and thank you, Mary Jo, that it's the information, but it also helps that everybody's plugged in and understands what the requirements are. So I think I got back on track with a couple of minutes for questions, so let me just go ahead and open it up and see if, yes, sir?
In the case of Kohn, the guy on the boat,
Yeah.
like a blackmail artist, do they come back at you over and over again? Because that's a relatively small amount that they're asking.
This guy was making $30,000 a day doing that. $30,000 a day doing that. So, yeah, look, the trick always is, yeah, they're going to come back if they can. But you've gotten the virus out of the system, and you've hopefully told everybody what happened without maybe naming names. And so the next time somebody sees that, they're not going to make the same mistake again.
Do they actually pull the virus out, or do they feign to do it and then just give it back to them?
There is honor amongst thieves.
There is an honor.
There is, yes. They usually give you the decryption key, and you're usually able to get it out.
And they move on to the next.
And they move on. Look, this is target of opportunity. So, yes, sir.
I've heard, like you would agree, that the fact that you're a small company or your size of your company sometimes doesn't matter because hackers are just looking for easy open ports and ways to get in, and quite frankly, they don't even know who they're going into and looking for information. So
Right.
I guess my question is then, if that's the case, which it seems like you agree, then the fact that you're a small, in your mind, you're a small little alarm company, there's no real saving grace.
Not at all. You're right. The size of the company isn't the issue. I mean, I was not kidding when I said it's a target of opportunity. They're just fishing around, pardon the pun, looking for ways to get in. And if they can get in and they can actually see that you've got something of value, which could frankly be, you know, the easiest target of opportunity may be your employee records. And they'll just take them and they'll run with them.
So it sure seems to me that this is another case of government run amok. In that DOJ, it's very clear that DOJ will come after us if they believe we're in violation. Who's the lead law enforcement agency to find the bad people outside of the 50 states?
Well, let me answer you this way. In just about every major city, there is usually a cybercrimes task force. And if it's a model anything like what is in Los Angeles, it's a one-stop shop. And what I mean by that is it's usually led by the Secret Service, it has FBI on board, and it also has local police on board. And it very often happens that you will call, you will get a Secret Service agent, whoever the duty agent happens to be, and they will tell you within 5 minutes, oh, we've got that going in Boston, we know this guy, or we've got that going in Tampa, we know this guy. Going outside the U.S. raises a whole bunch of other issues, and that's really becomes international. The thing to think about, though, is at least the state of the law right now is if you've been hacked, you can't go back the other way and hack. The defensive hack to go back and try to intrude the bad guy's system actually is a violation of law.
Really?
Yeah. I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's the current state. Les, you had your hand up.
Yeah, is it my understanding that various jurisdictions have actually passed legislation which effectively will fine the company if they don't meet various elements of protection in this particular area?
There's 45 plus states, and they all have something a little different in them. The one thing they have in common is the notice requirement to consumers. But whether they have any other standards really depends on looking at what's going on in the individual state. I'm not aware of any such standards as relates to California. That's it. I got everybody's questions answered, and we're all going to go to the bar, right? And pull the plug. All right, well, thank you all very much for your attention, and thank you for staying.
So, Susan, thank you very much. This is obviously a very important topic. Thank you very much for those that stayed. It's a tough time of the day to do it, I know. Okay. It's a terrific presentation on behalf of CAA. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So, everyone, the events this evening begin at 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock is the cocktail hour till 8 o'clock. And then we will be having our dinner and our awards banquet for Matt that we very much look forward to. And then tomorrow morning we begin, Les, is it at 8:45? And we will be discussing, I think, the last couple days and the leadership theme throughout it. Perfect. Okay. Thanks, everyone.